We are skipping the intro theme. Imagine sub-mediocre pop music juxtaposed with pictures of eagles, Jesus, and all other things religious and jingoistic.
I think that we evolved from animals.
I believe in creation. I don't believe in the story of creation. I do believe in most of the Bible, though. I believe in creation.
No idea.
Creation. I believe in creation.
We look similar to apes.
I believe in God.
I think it's a mystery. It's not for humans to know.
I think that evolution probably is very valid, but I also like to believe in creation.
I started leaning towards the evolution idea, but there's no power in it, like there is in the power of God.
We are still amazed that creationists would rather harass shoppers at the local mall than gather evidence to support their claims.
For the remainder of this program, we're going to put you right here, where I'm sitting, in the juror's box.
In other words, welcome to Pretend Land.
But this time you're going to hear the facts about evolution versus creation.
We will be presenting those.
Not some media spin, not wishful thinking, not the biased view of a scientific minority.
That responsibility lies with Janet Folger and the members of Duane Gish's Institute for Creation Research. Who is Janet Folger? She's the author of a few books attempting to further the agenda of the religious right, president of Faith to Action, a group best known for its opposition to the Local Law Enforcement Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2007, also known as Matt Shepard's Law.
Just a plain old-fashioned expose on the facts. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Check the facts yourself.
This is why we happily include all of our references. Does anyone want to take bets on whether Miss Folger will be so obliging?
Don't do what most of us do, which is to give in to our natural tendency to act like cattle and just follow the herd. Don't take my word for it, but do me one other favor as well. Stop taking the media and evolutionists' word for it also. You know, when you stop to think about it, it's kind of sad, really, because we've grown so accustomed to just taking the word of any intelligent man in a lab coat with a doctor in front of his name that we've forgotten how to think for ourselves.
Remember that last tidbit about the lab coat.
And I assure you the facts I'm talking about are easy to prove. In fact, some basic common sense will do it.
Science relies on evidence, not intuition.
Because the truth is, you've been misled, scammed, lied to. You've let the evolutionists make a monkey out of you.
That is not a monkey.
And now it's time to turn the tables.
We swear that we are not out to get you. However, your cousin, that's a different story. He owes us money. A lot of money.
I'm going to expose 10 outright lies, 10 myths that have been fed to the American public by a very small percentage of people and organizations with an agenda all their own.
We have not even finished the introduction, and Miss Folger is playing the evil evolutionist conspiracy card.
And sadly, many of the rest of us have followed along blindly.
That would be your failing. Seriously, shape up, people. If a creationist can figure out that you're not doing your homework, everyone else knew over 100 years ago.
We've grown up with years and years of being brainwashed.
This has become increasingly tedious. We're going to summarize the rest of Miss Folger's introduction so that we can get to her first real argument. Miss Folger claims that evolution is junk science. She accuses you of being mindless chattel, too ignorant to weigh the evidence for yourself. She claims that the Bible is a magical textbook. She further claims it is historically accurate, apparently unaware of the contradicting evidence. This leads to the proclamation that her deity is cranky and causes natural disasters to seek vengeance against, well, everyone. She concludes with a classic threat of violence against the heathen, so all of you watch out.
One of the classic myths that the spin doctors have managed to sway popular opinion with over the years is that evolution is somehow a fact of science.
After making so many of these videos, it is no longer shocking when creationists are forced to rely on ad hominem attacks. And for the record, Miss Folger issued her attack less than 20 seconds after stating the following.
Leave your prejudices, your prejudgments, your preconceived notions behind.
Seriously, is anyone shocked by such contradictory actions? Go ahead, raise your hand. You in the back, you can just leave. So, what is a scientific fact? It's any verifiable observation. The fact of evolution is that allelic frequencies present in a population change over time. This observation has been verified. many times.
They work very hard at creating this image that this intellectual approach to life is waging a noble fight for truth against all those narrow-minded bigots who blindly believe in religion.
While we could write a witty retort detailing how Miss Folger is currently leading opposition against expanding hate crime legislation to protect minorities facing true bigotry, we feel that all of you are more than capable of making that connection.
Well, if evolution is a scientific fact, then it might surprise you to hear that a scientist from Pensacola, Florida, Dr. Ken Hovind.
Remember Miss Folger's previous comment about lab coats? Well, Mr. Hovind is about as much of a scientist as a rock is an astrophysicist. We apologize to any rocks which may have heard such an insensitive remark.
Has a standing offer of $250,000, and I quote, to anyone who can give any, and I emphasize any, empirical evidence for evolution. That's right. You understood that correctly. Since 1990, Dr. Hovind has offered any and all takers the opportunity to provide any scientific proof for evolution. If anyone ever could, he would immediately hand over $250,000. And guess what? Despite newspaper articles and cover stories on National Geographic all about those evolutionary proofs, Dr. Hovind's $250,000 is still safely in his own hands.
Rather than doing something productive with his life, Mr. Hovind had a sham contest based on a strawman argument against evolutionary biology. Currently, the federal government is seeking over $500,000 in restitution against Mr. Hovind. We would say more, but creation science evangelism would probably throw another temper tantrum and file more false DMCA takedown orders in an attempt to silence us.
How can that be? Well, you see, evolution is a theory.
So, what is a scientific theory? It's a logically self-contained model or framework for describing a related set of natural phenomenon. The theory of evolution unites the many observations that populations change over time into a framework which serves as the foundation for modern biology.
Not a scientific fact, as it's generally considered to be.
We have already covered the verified observation that allelic frequencies of a population vary over time.
And it's often portrayed by many of our school textbooks and in museums. In fact, if you want to be scientifically accurate about it, evolution doesn't even qualify to be a theory.
That was completely dishonest.
Despite the fact that it's the term most commonly used for it. No, in reality, it's not a theory at all. It's a model.
It is always amusing when creationists begin demonstrating a complete lack of understanding of the topic they are attacking. Theories are models.
That's because scientific theories have to be observed, tested, and results repeated.
In the case of evolutionary biology, this process has been ongoing for nearly 150 years. It has been remarkable how robust this biological theory has been.
But evolution has never been observed. No one was there when life first appeared on this planet.
That was a rather obtuse straw man argument. Abiogenesis is not evolution.
Nor can evolution be tested.
To accept this tidbit of nonsense, you are going to need to completely ignore such amazing findings as these haplotype maps.
Chemists have never been able to create life from non-living matter.
Actually, the Solera Corporation is currently working ever closer to completing a completely synthetic bacterium. And again, abiogenesis is not evolution.
And despite the countless millions of species that scientists claim were involved in our past, mysteriously, evolution has never repeated in modern history, or at any other point in recorded history.
This is actually a prediction of evolutionary biology. Becoming less adapted to an environmental niche would be rather catastrophic to a population facing competition from others.
Ken Ham, a former science teacher who now heads up the organization Answers in Genesis, explains.
To say to them, hey, you told us to trust the scientists got it wrong. They've changed their theories. But you know what? The Word of God hasn't changed. Why didn't you tell us to trust the Word of God?
Mr. Ham still seems more concerned with preserving religious dogma than examining the evidence.
And so I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the Scopes trial. So when people tell us, I often hear secular scientists say, creation, evolution, that issue was resolved at the Scopes trial. Wait a minute, do you realize most of the evidence for evolution back then, today, is no longer accepted by evolutionists at all? No, we need to learn the lesson of the Scopes trial.
This is patently absurd. Very little has been overturned. Instead, we have a much better understanding of the process of evolution.
So it would be a gross exaggeration, at best, to state or even imply that evolution is a scientific fact.
That concludes Miss Folger's strawman and dishonesty-riddled semantics argument. Now allow us to present the reality of the issue. The fact of evolution is the verifiable observation that the ratios of alleles present in populations change from generation to generation. This observation has been made countless times. The theory of evolution is the grand unifying principle of modern biology, based on the explanation of the fact of evolution. It makes many predictions, such as common descent, natural selection, sexual selection, genetic drift, adaptation, speciation, extinction, etc. The theory of evolution can be used to develop a model of evolution, which can then be applied to new observations to test hypotheses. One such example is the general time reversible model of nucleotide sequence evolution. This is the formula for calculating the log likelihood of the evolution occurring at a single site in a nucleotide sequence. It's a good thing we have computers now.
Let me show you how the myths about evolution, having been proven, are created.
Almost all science textbooks include England's peppered moth as the classic example of evolution by natural selection. The theory says that dark and light-colored moths rested on tree trunks during the day, and birds ate them.
The hypothesis actually stated that birds preferentially preyed on the two different color morphs depending on the environmental conditions.
But on trees covered with a whitish-colored fungus.
No, it's a lichen.
The light moths were able to survive because they were camouflaged. When the Industrial Revolution hit, pollution and dark soot reversed the effects.
No, it changed the selective pressure.
There was a scientific hypothesis that in periods where the trees of a forest were darkened by industrial smoke, moths which were dark in color would be better able to survive because the birds wouldn't be able to see them. And light-colored moths would be eaten more often, and so for a time you would get more dark moths and fewer light moths in a population.
In other words, evolution was happening.
Scientists who believed in the myth of evolution gloated over this.
That was another ad hominem attack.
Saying the results proved that evolution by natural selection is true.
Frankly, the observational evidence was extremely compelling.
The problem is, peppered moths don't rest on tree trunks during the day.
That was another outright lie. 50.4% of peppered moths rest at the junction of branches in the trunk. 37% rest directly on the trunk.
After more than 40 years of intense field study, only 2 peppered moths have ever been seen naturally resting on tree trunks.
That is another lie.
It seems this clear case of Darwinian evolution by natural selection is just one more example of wishful thinking and scientific blunders.
That was an appeal to ridicule based on the previous lies.
So where did all the evolution textbook get pictures of peppered moths on different colored tree trunks? You'll probably be amazed to discover just how far this media spin was taken by scientists who wanted to believe their own story. They were all staged.
Yes, our esteemed creationists seem to believe that insects regularly pose for photographs while being preyed on by birds.
The moths were glued, pinned, placed into tree trunks, and their pictures taken. The scientists who used the pictures in their books to prove evolution all conveniently forgot to tell their readers that little subtle fact.
Alright, it is time to end this rather pathetic hatchet job on Dr. Bernard Kettlewell. Here's the actual story of the research on the peppered moth. The peppered moth has 2 distinct color morphs controlled by a single locus. There's the light morph and the dark. Dr. Bernard Kettlewell began studying peppered moths in 1952. His initial observation was that the dark morph dominated in industrial areas, while the light morph dominated rural areas. This observation was not horribly shocking, as it had been made prior to Darwin's publication of On the Origin. Yes, in spite of what creationists claim, intensive study on the peppered moth began shortly after discovery of the first dark morph in 1811. In 1896, J.W. Tutt hypothesized that the change was due to selective predation by birds. He carried out small, simple predation experiments that supported his hypothesis. By 1895, dark morphs represented 98% of the population in Manchester, England. In 1948, they represented only about 2% of the population. It was also deduced that the coloration was controlled by the spread of a single allele. Over 100 years after intensive study began on the peppered moth, Bernard Kettlewell finally takes the stage in this drama, or rather melodrama. Kettlewell's first experiments involved controlled release of a mixed group of peppered moths into an aviary. Kettlewell recorded the proportion of survivors at various time intervals. Again, the evidence supported bird predation based on color morph. In 1953, Kettlewell conducted mark, release, and recapture experiments in a polluted woodland. Again, bird predation based on color morph was the supported conclusion, and we have to thank those poor unfortunate grad students who had to run through the woods in the middle of the night catching moths for that. In 1955, Kettlewell repeated the experiment using an unpolluted woodland. Again, the same conclusion was reached, and again, the grad students suffered for you. So, what about Miss Folger's accusation? Those were Kettlewell's controlled predation experiments to confirm his previous findings while eliminating as many variables as possible. Because insects are rather uncooperative in arranging themselves into a scientific prey preference experiment, Dr. Kettlewell eliminated as many uncontrolled variables as possible, which is a hallmark of scientific methodology, by placing the different color morphs on trees. Dr. Kettlewell was never deceptive about the conditions of his experiments. Dr. Michael Majerus has continued Kettlewell's work. Majerus' studies have determined the natural resting places of peppered moths, as well as confirmed predation by birds as the primary selective pressure. Majerus was also able to further show that the lichen of the trees camouflaged light morphs in both the visible as well as the ultraviolet spectrum. Dark morphs were likewise camouflaged in both spectrums, except that they absorb UV light rather than reflect it, much like the bark of a bare tree. Oh, and for the record, birds are capable of seeing in both the visible spectrum as well as the ultraviolet. Following environmental cleanup in the 1960s, the proportion of dark morphs has been steadily decreasing. It appears that Miss Folger's knowledge of this topic both begins and ends with Dr. Kettlewell's controlled experiment. Rather than examine all of the evidence, she has misguidedly attacked one small aspect of an immense body of research.
If the best example of evolution that has ever been documented has been used as proof by eminent evolutionary biologists for more than 40 years is not true,
as Miss Folger has demonstrated, attacking a straw man is rather easy. Miss Folger then selectively interprets various passages from the Bible and claims that they represent valid science. We cut that nonsense to spare you from it, except for one tidbit.
We know that when Columbus made his trip to discover India and landed here in America, that when he took off, there was tremendous fears that he would come to the edge of the earth and would plunge off into nothing.
That was complete and utter nonsense. Europeans fully understood that the earth was spheroid in shape. The contention was the distance that Columbus would need to travel before reaching Asia. The crack researchers at ICR are relying on Washington Irving's biography of Christopher Columbus. Irving incorporated as much factual material into the biography as he did in his more well-known work, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Also, it seems that ICR left out the little tidbit where it was the church which was claiming that the earth was flat. The quality of the research at ICR is simply staggering.
the real problem with Darwin's model of evolution is that Charles Darwin just failed to uncover the real evidence. Evidence that would have shown how wrong his ideas really were. Evidence that is surfacing every day. So what exactly did Charles Darwin write that divided the scientific world in 1859? In his book, Origin of the Species, he suggested that animals, including man, have all descended from a common ancestor, from simple marine organisms. Darwin wanted us to believe that simple organisms turned into fish, and then amphibians, part sea, part land animals, then reptiles, then mammals, primates, or apes, and finally humans. Basically, his theory was that man descended from a sludge pool over millions of years, and that our most recent ancestors are apes. That flatly contradicts the Bible's account in Genesis that each species, including humans, were created individually. Now, of course, evolutionary adaptation does occur within the same species. In other words, certain birds develop characteristics over time that help them adapt to their environment.
As a brief aside to this blatant straw man argument, if the deity magically created all species as Miss Folger just claimed, why do we observe the emergence of new species?
There's a certain amount of selection. You'll get variation. Finches that migrated to an island in the Galapagos group did vary and change. But they're still finches. They got there as finches, and they still are finches with variations.
Actually, each island of the Galapagos has several species of finch. They are all descended from the same founding population. This observation also contradicts Miss Folger's prior claim.
If you take two medium finches with medium-sized beaks and you breed them, you will get some finches with small beaks and some finches with larger beaks. Over time, as these finches spread out into the various environments, certain beak sizes would be favored in certain environments, and therefore they would become the predominant type. But the point is the capability to produce the small beaks, the medium beaks, and the large beaks was already in the parent population of the Galapagos finches, and it was simply the environmental differences that allowed them to be expressed. It was not the creation of any new and unique information.
Is everyone else tired of hearing the same old nonsense? Here's a quick look at some of Darwin's finches. Remember, ICR wants you to believe that that one founding population already contained all of these different finches. Again, our esteemed creationists have halted their research with the abstract of a single study. Over 20 years, scientists were able to observe and document changes in the beak size of Geospiza fortis. Much like Kettlewell's work, this study is but one string in a grand tapestry of research which creationists blatantly ignore.
But cats don't become dogs, and apes don't become humans.
Oddly enough, that non sequitur marks the end of the first segment of Miss Folger's argument. At best, she managed to weave together a rather obtuse semantic argument and a dishonest straw man against Dr. Kettlewell. These are the references. This is where we actually show you that we did the research for our slides. And, well, we also point out that Miss Folger, she didn't. She just made up nonsense.